My book, The Art and Making of Fantasy Miniatures, is available now. Check out the link in the description to find out more. This is a review of the CRPG book. Originally and currently a free ebook, it was physically published by Bitmap Books in 2019, and it's a guide and reference book to several hundred single-player CRPGs that were released in English from the birth of the genre in 1975 up to 2015. I'm a pretty big fan of these types of reference books. I have a lot of film and literary genre encyclopedia type books. They tend to come from small publishers or are self-published, and that goes especially for these type of retrospective video game books, of which there are tons, but this is the first one that truly impressed me, and so I sort of want to use it as an example for discussing how to make a great fan-made reference book that can justify its existence in an age where everyone has access to the internet. Because the thing is, if you boil these sort of books down to their core, perhaps to the point of being reductive, all this is a list and short description of some games. So rationally, why would you spend money on this sort of book when you have the internet, which has endless lists and information for every game ever made, millions of images, videos, countless different people's voices, and constant updates? It also takes up no space, is accessible everywhere, and completely free. This book is none of those things, but I still like it far better. It gave me a more enjoyable and memorable experience than the internet ever has. And look, if you're someone who thinks books like this are silly in the face of the internet, I think that's a completely justified and sensible opinion. But I would like to make a case using this book as an example as to how these books can present a more rewarding experience when done right. Primarily, it comes down to the idea that the information on the internet is scattered across infinite, ugly, bloated, repetitious sources that are in a constant state of flux. A book like this offers a more permanent record. Are the web pages, YouTube videos, forums going to be there in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? You don't know, and it's out of your control, but this book will still be there on your shelf, accessible for your entire life. Likewise, if you're a regular viewer of this channel and you like art books, coffee table books, and collecting and that sort of stuff, like me, you probably find more enjoyment in the physical ownership of something. That might be a foolish and outdated concept in the digital age, but the fact remains, some people still find enormous satisfaction in that. Speaking of which, the first thing that really makes this book exciting compared to a lot of other books of this kind is just how thick it is. It's a 500 plus page beast, but also very easy to wield and read. The format and physical properties of this book are perfectly balanced. And not only does it feel good physically, there's nothing fancy about this book, but it just nails top-notch, sturdy fundamentals of quality bookmaking, and it just looks and feels great. The binding especially is really well done. You see a lot of publishers being cheap in this area, which you just can't do for a book of this size. So it's a real quality production, unlike a lot of these type of fan books, which are often thin, poorly designed, print-on-demand crap. But also, this size of the book is not just superficial, but actually really important as to why it's so great, and that is, it tells you that this book is serious, that it wants to be the definitive source on the subject. You know, it's called the CRPG book. Even though it can't compare to the infinite content on the internet, a hefty tome like this promises you a substantial experience that other smaller, thinner books don't, and so I can't take them seriously. So before you even open the cover, this book is telling you, if you only get one book on the subject, it should be me. It could justifiably be called the CRPG Bible, and this is all communicated just through its size. Now, of course, that's worthless if the content doesn't live up to it, but it does 100%, 110% even. One of the things that has always turned me off Bitmap Books, the publisher, is that while their books are on wonderful subjects and look beautiful, the size of the books just become an illusion once you open it up and see that the actual content is spread quite thin. They tend to put form ahead of function, which is a big turn-off for me with any book, whereas this book is the first time I've seen one of their books that is absolutely jam-packed. So it lives up to that initial visual promise announced by the size of the book, which is such a gratifying and rare thing to see. This book maximizes its impact and substance in almost every possible way, which it has to be doing to provide reasonable competition to the internet. The other thing a reference book like this has to excel at is its curation, something the internet is very poor at, or at least very inconsistent. Mostly because the majority of the people curating it are fickle and don't have to take it as seriously as a published work does. Plus, even though the vast nature of the internet is its great advantage, it's also a big weakness, because stuff is all over the place. A book like this presents a carefully curated source that brings many other sources together under one cover. So I realize I've been talking for ages, yet haven't even touched on the book's book's actual content and what it covers, so we better do that now. So the book opens with several introductory articles, some history, some of the concepts of older CRPGs, and then it gets into the meat of the book, which are 1 to 2 page entries for about 300 CRPGs. Now, in the marketing copy, on the back cover, and even in the introduction, they mention the book covers over 400 games, which is a misleadingly generous figure. I imagine this inflated count comes from including sequels that are mentioned in tacked-on paragraphs at the end of a main entry, but I don't think that should count when plenty of sequel games do get their own dedicated entry. So, for example, each of the 3 Witcher games gets their own 2-page entry, so that counts as 3 games covered. However, something like Borderlands 2 that is only mentioned in a paragraph at the end of the Borderlands 1 entry shouldn't count. So saying the book reviews over 400 games could be true in an ambiguous sense, but in a practical sense it's kinda crafty, which is unnecessary when 300 games is still a wonderful number, so I just don't know why they felt the need to perhaps misleadingly overpromise when they didn't need to. But anyway, these entries are called reviews, but the focus isn't really being on critical reviews or assessments of the games, thank God. Instead, they tend to focus more on being descriptions of the game, telling you about the game, about the story, what kind of game it is, what you do in it, some of the notable or unique mechanics and features, and then often some background about the history and development of the game, how it compares to similar CRPGs, etc. And then at the end of the book there are some more little miscellaneous sections for things like recommended reading, mentions of some JRPGs as well as some cancelled CRPGs, which was really cool. And for the most part, I found all of this to be absolutely wonderful reading. I think the vast majority and direction of the entries are great, which is surprising given that the book is actually written by 119 contributors, but largely very consistent in terms of style and content. There's a little bit of an exception to this, but I'll save that for when we get into the criticisms. But definitely my favorite thing about the book when it comes to the text is that there is almost no fat in this book, despite its great size, which is definitely something I was worried about. A lot of these fan-written books tend to be a little too indulgent, sloppy, and padded out with boring pontifications about the genre, and I thought that a book of this size could easily be ruined and made boring if it was full of that sort of thing, but it is not at all. It's written and edited for maximum impact, and when combined with the page length of this book, you are getting your money's worth and a colossal amount of worthy content. There's almost nothing superfluous in this book, no chance of getting bored for even a second, and I super appreciate that. In fact, if anything, some people might say it's a little too fast-paced. You know, this isn't a laborious, comprehensive history of the genre. The background information and history articles, as well as each individual entry, are just enough to give you what you need to know. There are definitely people who will be disappointed that there's not more depth, but I think it's perfect and avoids indulging in bloated, ponderous essays. Similarly perfect is the ratio of number of games covered versus the length of each entry. This is something a lot of these sort of books struggle with. Usually they are either so comprehensive in the number of entries that they really are just an encyclopedic list with barely a paragraph of information for each entry, or they cover too few titles, usually the most well-known, and just waffle on for too long. And neither of those approaches is particularly satisfying, and so doesn't help in that competition against the internet. Whereas, reasonable physical limitations in bookmaking taken into account, this book is as close to perfect as you could possibly make it. It's also very approachable for newcomers to the genre, or those not familiar with the quirks and differences of how older games work. It's also the sort of book you can pick up and randomly open and just start reading, and from there jump around in the book however you feel like, but I found it would catch me in this really great cycle where I would just read it for hours at a time because it's such fast-paced and compulsive reading that I always wanted to turn the page and see the next game, which would then reference another game which I would then have to look up. The book's core gameplay loop, if you will, is being compelled by feelings of nostalgia reading about games from your past and the excitement of discovering new ones. And so almost every one of its 500 pages were genuinely enjoyable and inspiring reading, inspiring imagination, inspiring love of the genre, and inspiring me to spend money on the games. The games are covered chronologically, which is obviously the most sensible way to do a book like this, but there's also an index in the back in case you want to look up a game and don't know what year it was published. Each chapter covers a period of 5 years and all start with a little 2-page history write-up that just gives info on any trends and technological and industry developments that occurred during that time. In terms of the games they've chosen to cover, again, I think it's fantastic. Of course, there are going to be cases where you're like, how could they not include Game X when they have Game Y, which is not even a real RPG? But I really liked the balance of popular, important titles to the genre mixed in with lesser known but still noteworthy ones, which are actually the ones I found far more rewarding to read about, because reading 1 or 2 pages about a game you've already played isn't as interesting because you know all about them already, whereas I found much more joy in just how many new games I discovered. I mean, if you're the sort of person who is an obsessive expert who's played every CRPG, then you'll probably snort with derision at how basic this book is compared to your towering, panty-dropping knowledge. But for most fans of the genre, I can't imagine you won't discover some new hidden gems, to the point that I should warn you that this book's probably going to end up costing you more money than you think, as it was directly responsible for me spending 4 times the cover price on buying the games on Steam. Thankfully, most of them are so old that there's very little risk in spending the less than $5 to try it out and mess around for a few evenings. Also, tons of the older ones are freeware now. But more than that, even though you could look at these entries in the book as just being basic descriptions of the games, I found enormous joy in just discovering and reading about these worlds and adventures. Even if they sound like crappy games that I'd never play, I still liked being made aware of their existence, or similarly reading about important classics that maybe many gamers today don't have the patience to play, but are still great to know about. And so I think the book stands as a really great record and testament to the imagination of these interactive worlds and ideas. One thing I will say about these entries is that in terms of reviews, they are overwhelmingly positive, even for games that are objectively complete shite. For each game, they absolutely point out some of the weaknesses and frustrations, but for probably greater than 85%, they are very much about the idea of encouraging you to try the game, with only maybe a couple of dozen negative exceptions. Which, even when they are misleadingly generous or obscuring the bad with the good, I think this was the absolute right way to go for this book. And I love that they did, and that the focus is on the positive aspects of each game. That's how it should be for a book that's supposed to be a love letter to the genre and for fans of the genre. Because one thing I hate about these fan reviewy type books is that they become too opinionated, full of comic book guy-like chastisements, being too critical with personal, witty scorn and giving the entries starred reviews or something, which, thank God, this book avoids, mostly. And this is where we get into the only 2 genuine criticisms I have of the book. So the biggest one is, even though I just said that these entries aren't really negative, critiquey reviews, and that the writing is really consistent despite having 119 contributors, for overall intents and purposes, that is true for the vast majority, but not for the entirety. There are literally only 2 or 3 writers who are just wet blankets who focus on being overly and bemoaningly critical, and this just isn't the book for that. Their entries stand out like a sore thumb compared to the other writers, and it just pointlessly sucks the enjoyment right out of the book. And of course, pointing out the negatives is important. The problem is when these snotty grievances are being allowed to too heavily colour the focus and tone, which creates an inconsistent feel. And so you sometimes have bad games that get overwhelmingly positive write-ups, and good games that get really negative ones. Like I said, the ones that are misleadingly positive aren't really a problem, because you can chalk that up to enthusiasm for the genre the book's celebrating, but the overwhelmingly negative ones, again, of which there are only a few, but they just suck the fun out of it and feel biased in a way that's less easy to humour, and especially when it's really only the same 2 contributors who seem to hate everything. Those are the major offenders who should not have been included, but even among the other contributors, depending on who's writing any given entry, there is a degree of inconsistency in tone and focus, with some being too casual, opinionated, and giving less actual information on the game, versus the majority of the entries, which are more professional and focus mostly on delivering useful, objective information. Many entries are even a mix of both approaches, but I just don't like it when it indulges in the writer's personal opinions or experiences. There are more uses of I, me, and my than I would expect from a book like this, and this occasional lack of professionalism and objectivity makes it harder to take the book seriously, and it's just worthless. Working against everything I've previously said that this book needs to be, and for the most part is, but I don't see why I should be paying for the pleasure of the personal opinions, stories, and critical assessments of these people. That's what the internet's for. It'd be like if I published the sort of reviews I do here in book form. that'd be worthless. Some nerd bashing a game they personally don't like or telling me what it was like the day they bought the game is just not of interest to readers, and so all that is the major thing I would like to have been completely absent from the book. It's not nearly a big enough issue that it should turn you off the book, so I want to stress that 95% of the writers are basically doing a perfect job, but I still want you to understand it's not perfect, and there are times when it feels more like a gaming magazine on steroids rather than the strong, professional book it needs to be in order to justify its existence. Speaking of which, the other pretty major blemish I noticed that makes it harder to take the book seriously is the sheer number of typos, which never really bothers me in a book beyond making it feel a little sloppy, but I have to mention it in this case because never in my entire life have I seen any other book even come close to the staggering number of obvious typos this one has. I didn't notice any informational mistakes, although I am not confident enough in my knowledge of the games for that to mean anything, but nor even spelling mistakes. Rather, it's the grammar, punctuation, and especially syntax, which is always a sure sign that the copy editor or proofreader ran it through a computer spell check, but didn't actually do their job and go through the text themselves. I'm not talking pedantic grammatical rules either. I mean stuff like using women instead of woman, or most frequent is the absence or addition of a random word where it seems like two different sentence structures have been mashed together. And the reason I even mention all this is because in the introduction, the book's creator / project editor mentions that they got the book proofread, so I hope no one got paid for that. But yeah, it just does not read like a book that was written by an author, read by a project editor, proofreader, and publisher's team. It's actually inconceivable that many people could be so negligent to allow, I would say, upwards of 50 very obvious mistakes that I noticed make their way into the book. Plus, it does then make me worry about potential informational errors if this is how inattentive the creators are. The ultimate blame lies with Bitmap Books, who should be thoroughly embarrassed for not paying nearly enough attention and releasing a book absolutely riddled with copy errors. It's another disappointingly unprofessional blemish for a book that otherwise excels in every other area. Although maybe this is deliberate and they're trying to be evocative of the bug-riddled state most RPGs launch in, so maybe we have to wait for the unofficial fan patch to fix all that. So I hope they're a little more careful for their next book, A Guide to Japanese Role-Playing Games, which actually comes out next week and is, I imagine, kind of a spiritual companion to this book you may want to look out for. For anyone interested in more CRPGs, you might also come across a book called Dungeons and Desktops and wonder how that compares to this book, and the answer is it doesn't. There's no contest. Dungeons and Desktops isn't necessarily a bad book, it just falls prey to many of the weaknesses I've mentioned these sort of books tend to display, and basically the CRPG book is superior in every single way. However, it was directly inspired by Dungeons and Desktops, so it's still important to give it due respect. One other thing that's not a criticism, but I felt was missing from this book, is the box art for each game, which may not have been possible to include on each entry's page because they genuinely are so packed full of stuff, but I think it would have been really cool had they used a box art gallery as the contents page. That way we would get the box art and it would provide a nifty way to visually discover and look up different games. Even though I've kind of been pitting this book against the internet in order to make a point, the truth is they actually work together. This book is a concentrated hub from which the internet can be used for further exploration. But as for this book specifically, it's not just that I find it to be an impressive book objectively, but as a fan, as the sort of person this book was written for, I can say that in terms of my personal experience, it all comes together for compulsive reading that just feels good and inspired me to explore and revel in this genre for weeks, resulting in a richer, more focused experience than I've ever had just using the internet. And so I wish more reference books use this CRPG book as a model for how to do it right, both physically and in terms of content. And not just video game books, but film and literature and everything, because the casual tone and personal opinions it contains aside, I think this is a truly outstanding book that I could not recommend more highly to fans of the genre.